Bonjour. Hi there. Merci. Thank you for being here. Big thank you to my House Leader, Peter Julian, for being here as well. It's great to see you, Peter, even though we're not in the same space, but it's cool to have you beside me. Friends, today is a chance for us to see whether the Liberals meant what they said when they promised universal pharmacare, or was it just nice words and they never intended to make it happen? Because what we are going to vote on today is a bill being introduced, or has been introduced, by Peter Julian, our Member of Parliament for New Westminster Burnaby, and also House Leader. A bill presented on behalf of New Democrats, which will establish the framework for medication coverage for all. This framework, mind you, is exactly what the Liberal government's own report, commissioned by them, recommends as a key step. So this is exactly what their own commission report recommends. And this is a clear step forward to establishing that universal pharmacare for all, that medication coverage for all. And why it's so important. In this pandemic, we have found that even more Canadians cannot afford the medication that they need. And the idea that in a pandemic, that some of the most vulnerable people have been the hardest hit, and on top of being hardest hit, that they can no longer afford the medication they need, is a shame, and it should not continue. We already knew that millions of Canadians go without the medication they need. I've heard countless heartbreaking stories from seniors, from young people, from people suffering from type 1 diabetes, from so many people that cannot or are struggling to be able to afford the medication they need. And it does not have to be this way. We are the only country in the world that doesn't include universal pharmacare or medication coverage into our healthcare system. No one in our country should have to make the impossible choice between buying medication or putting food on the table. But people are making that impossible choice. Today is also a day when we will see whether this Liberal government and Justin Trudeau are on the side of people who want this universal pharmacare, medication coverage for all, or whether Justin Trudeau is on the side of Big Pharma, who clearly does not want this. And we've seen that caving into the interests or supporting the interests or being on the side of Big Pharma has not helped Canadians. We are amongst the lowest if you look at developed nations. We are underperforming far smaller economies when it comes to vaccine delivery and rollout and vaccination. So it's clearly not worked being on the side of Big Pharma, and it hurts people. So we'll see those two things, whether this government really believes in universal pharmacare or whether they really are on the side of people or on the side of Big Pharma. Those are things we'll see today. Donc, aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment le moment pour voir si ce gouvernement libéral, si Justin Trudeau a vraiment voulu mettre en œuvre une assurance médicament universelle ou non. C'est aujourd'hui le temps de voir ça. Parce que ce qu'on va voter, le projet de loi sur lequel on va voter, c'est exactement ce que le rapport dit qu'on doit faire pour aller de l'avant pour une assurance médicaments entièrement publique. C'est exactement ce que le rapport demande. C'est un projet de loi tel comme on a proposé. Je veux remercier mon leader en chambre, Peter Julian, pour son travail et pour proposer ce projet de loi au nom de tous les néo-démocrates. C'est aussi le moment qu'on va voir si ce gouvernement libéral, Justin Trudeau, est du bord des gens qui veulent avoir une assurance médicaments entièrement publique, ou si Justin Trudeau est du bord des grandes compagnies pharmaceutiques qui ne veulent pas avoir un tel système. Donc, c'est le moment pour voir ça. Et dans cette pandémie, plus que jamais, c'est clair, il y a plusieurs Canadiens qui ne peuvent pas acheter les médicaments dont ils ont besoin. La situation était difficile, mais c'est encore pire maintenant à cause de la pandémie et à cause de la situation que les gens font face. Donc, c'est le moment maintenant pour voir c'est quoi le vrai visage des libéraux, et on va le voir dans quelques heures aujourd'hui. Donc, je suis prêt pour vos questions, mais avant de ça, je vais passer la parole à mon leader en chambre, Peter Julian. Before going to questions, I'm going to pass the mic over to Peter Julian, who sponsored this bill, put it forward, and it's being voted on today. I'm really thankful. It's my good friend and House Leader, Peter Julian. Please, the mic is yours.
Merci beaucoup, M. Singh. Et j'aimerais souligner qu'aujourd'hui, c'est le 25e anniversaire de la mort de Tommy Douglas, qui est le père de notre système universel des soins de santé. Alors, c'est extrêmement approprié et important le vote qui aura lieu dans juste quelques heures. Et pendant la pandémie, comme Jagmeet vient de dire si bien, on a besoin plus que jamais d'avoir en place un système d'assurance médicaments qui est universel et qui est public. Et là, je pense que la réponse des Canadiennes et des Canadiennes à ce projet de loi démontre l'importance que les gens y attachent. Plus que 100 000 Canadiennes et Canadiennes ont contacté leurs députés depuis quelques semaines pour leur demander de voter oui pour ce projet de loi. Plus qu'une centaine des municipalités canadiennes, y compris plus qu'une quarantaine des municipalités au Québec, ont demandé à leurs députés effectivement de voter oui. Puis on a bien sûr l'appui des médecins et des médecines, des infirmiers, des infirmières, le mouvement syndical, y compris au Québec. Il y a un mouvement massif vers un vote oui cet après-midi. Alors, c'est extrêmement important. Je pense que les députés écoutent et que surtout les députés libéraux qui ont été contactés par les milliers par les gens qui votent oui cet après-midi. C'est important, comme le rapport Hoskins a démontré si clairement, qu'on a en place le même cadre légal autour de l'assurance médicaments qu'on a déjà pour les soins de santé. So given that today is the 25th anniversary of the passing of Tommy Douglas, it's extremely appropriate and historic, the vote that will be held this afternoon on the Canada Pharmacare Act. And particularly during a pandemic, as Jagmeet has mentioned, it is more important than ever that Canadians get the coverage that they need. It is estimated that up to 10 million Canadians have no coverage for the medication that their doctors prescribe. And indeed, we know that hundreds of Canadians die each year not being able to pay for their medication. And so we have seen over the last few weeks more than 100,000 Canadians contact their members of parliament, above all Liberal MPs, to urge them to vote yes on the Canada Pharmacare Act. More than 100 Canadian cities and towns, including more than 40 in Quebec, have also contacted, endorsed the legislation. All of the labor movement, National Associations of Doctors and Nurses, the CFNU, they have all endorsed the bill. So we're hoping that members of parliament have been listening to that significant support. Polls show us 90% of Canadians support universal public pharmacare. And the real test is this afternoon when members of parliament will be called upon to vote on this important legislation.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate the work you've done to put into this and all the clear endorsements that we've been able to gain on this. Merci infiniment, Peter. Et maintenant, on est prêt pour vos questions. We're ready for any questions you might have.
We'll now start the question period. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période de questions. Comme d'habitude, une question de suivi. We'll start with a question on the phone and then turn to the room. Opérateur, on est prêt pour prendre la première question au téléphone.
Merci. La première question est de Catherine Lévesque de la Presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour, Mme Lévesque.
Bonjour, je voulais revenir sur l'aide médicale à mourir. Est-ce que vous en avez parlé en caucus aujourd'hui et est-ce que vous êtes arrivé à un consensus avec vos députés sur la réponse du gouvernement aux amendements du Sénat?
Oui, on a dit qu'on va accepter la motion des conservateurs, mais on va voter contre la motion proposée par le gouvernement pour les mêmes raisons qu'on a déjà données, que le Sénat a effectivement refait le travail des élus et ce n'est pas approprié et on va voter contre ça.
OK, merci beaucoup. Et je me demandais, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de l'idée de demander un délai supplémentaire aux tribunaux afin de respecter le jugement Truchon? Est-ce que c'est une bonne idée, à votre avis, d'avoir ce délai supplémentaire-là? Et quel message est-ce que ça envoie aux personnes qui attendent l'aide médicale à mourir?
Je pense que c'est un autre dossier où le gouvernement libéral a vraiment échoué leur responsabilité. C'était un échec parce qu'ils ont eu le temps de faire le travail nécessaire. Je sais qu'il y a plusieurs communautés comme la communauté des personnes handicapées qui se sentent pas entendues sur cette question, sur ce dossier. Donc, le gouvernement libéral a mal géré ce dossier et à cause de ça, on est dans une situation où il y a un deadline et le gouvernement peut-être va le manquer. Donc, c'est encore un autre exemple de comment le gouvernement a mal géré ce dossier.
Opérateur, prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Oui, la prochaine question vient de M. Richard Filion de TVA. La parole est à vous.
Oui, merci. Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
Je voudrais vous entendre sur un autre enjeu. Il y a le Bloc québécois qui réclame des excuses de M. Trudeau relativement à des documents publiés par la CBC, là, du département d'État américain en 1976. Vous avez peut-être entendu parler, là, un ancien diplomate américain qui relate dans ses écrits que M. Trudeau voulait, semble-t-il, faire la vie dure au Québec en demandant à Paul Desmarais de transférer des emplois à l'extérieur de la province. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec le Bloc que M. Trudeau devrait s'excuser?
Je pense que c'est déplorable. Ce n'est pas un surpris, mais c'est complètement inexcusable parce que le potentiel impact négatif sur les Québécois et Québécoises était là. Donc, c'est vraiment déplorable. Pour moi, je veux que le gouvernement concentre sur l'importance de la vaccination à ce moment. Et pour Justin Trudeau, la seule priorité doit être la sécurisation des vaccins et la vaccination de la population.
Vous dites que c'est déplorable, mais selon vous, est-ce que...
Je m'excuse pour l'instant, ils ont demandé la même réponse en anglais et je la donne et puis votre suivi. Un instant, s'il vous plaît. Just in English on that same point, I think it is deplorable the idea of putting a lot of Quebecers into a difficult position. Not having work is completely unexcusable. But for the work of the Prime Minister, I think he should focus on one sole priority, which should be getting enough vaccine and making sure everyone is vaccinated. Getting people the help they need in this pandemic should be his sole focus right now. And that's our position on that. Et puis, votre suivi?
Oui, vous dites, je comprends que vous dites que la priorité absolue de M. Trudeau, ça doit être la vaccination, les vaccins, mais dans la mesure où vous dites que c'est inexcusable, est-ce qu'il doit présenter des excuses selon vous?
S'ils veulent s'excuser, c'est à lui de décider, mais je veux encore qu'il concentre ses efforts sur la vaccination de la population, la sécurisation des vaccins. Ça, c'est la priorité pour moi.
Opérateur, prochaine question. Oui, opérateur, prochaine question.
Oui, la prochaine question vient d'un participant, de M. Tom Korski from Black Clocks.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you, Mr. Singh. I'm assuming you can hear me. The House voted down a very similar motion sponsored by the member for Vancouver Kingsway in 2017. If you assume that there will be a similar result this time, is there any reflection then on any hammer you could have used in a minority parliament to make this a condition on future support for cabinet?
This vote is a very important vote for a couple of reasons. One, the Liberals themselves have campaigned on universal pharmacare, and we had our doubts when they said that because they didn't say the universal and public for all pharmacare, medication coverage for all. They didn't say that, but we had hoped that they would actually follow through. This has been a promise that Liberals have made for over 2 decades. They've promised pharmacare. And we knew that the initial vision around a universal healthcare was to also include medication coverage. So really, this is a test. They've since campaigned on it in 2019. They said in the last election, they believe that there should be universal pharmacare. So here's a chance for them to prove it. And what we're proposing, to be very clear, is exactly what their own commission report requests and says is an essential part of bringing forward a universal pharmacare for all. That this framework that we're establishing is exactly what the report requests or demands to move forward. So this is really a chance to see, does this Liberal government believe in medication coverage for all or not? And it really is an opportunity for them to show, are they on the side of the people who want this vastly, unions, all the experts, people in general, or are they on the side of big pharma that is absolutely opposed to this? We're going to see very soon.
Well, can I ask you,
If I-
should also
Yeah, we'll have a quick addition from Peter Julian, and then we'll go to your follow-up.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add that on March 13th, 2020, a non-binding motion in favor of universal pharmacare passed through the House on division. So yes, you're citing 2017, but in 2020, on division, Don Davies' motion on universal pharmacare passed.
Thank you. Then my final question is it a test of your determination to press these issues, Pharmacare? You've also raised excess profits tax. There have been, a couple of other issues as a condition of perpetuating this parliament. We can go to an election anytime you choose, Mr. Singh. So at what point do you pull support from cabinet for all the things they would like to do if they don't comply with these requests?
On the question of when we go to an election, pulling support, very important question. And I've been really clear, but I think it's very important to repeat this so that people know. I have made a commitment that we will not be, as New Democrats, triggering an election while we are fighting the pandemic. While we are trying to get vaccines to every Canadian, while we're trying to get everyone vaccinated, that we should not be plunging the country into an election. So I've made that commitment that in this time when we're fighting this pandemic and we need to get vaccines, people want to move on with their life, and the only way forward is to get vaccinated. That is our priority. And we've called on Justin Trudeau to do the same thing. In fact, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government want to go to an election. They're signaling it again and again. They're looking for an excuse to go to an election. So our leverage is if they want to pass a bill, they need to come to us for support to pass bills. And we've used that position to do really important things to get more help to people that were in need. We increased the amount of money that families were able to receive when they were struggling. We made sure that people were able to keep their jobs. We brought forward paid sick leave so that people could stay at home if they're sick. So we were able to support people in this pandemic, and we were able to fight and win successful victories for people. But we are not in the position, we do not take the position that this is the time for an election. We will be ready to fight one. We're absolutely ready to fight one, but we are not calling for one. We are not advocating for one. In fact, if there's an election, the only reason one is going to happen in this time while we should be fighting the pandemic will be because Justin Trudeau decides to do so.
We'll now take questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions dans la salle. CBC.
Hi, Mr. Singh.
Hey there.
Just want to ask you this question. From what I understand and from what my colleagues understand, this bill creates a plan for Pharmacare that could possibly be adopted by the provinces if they decide to embrace it. So are you kind of misrepresenting what this bill intends to do? Because it won't create Pharmacare, it will just create a plan, and then that plan needs to be possibly adopted by the provinces.
So the really simple answer to this is that Eric Hoskins was commissioned by the Liberal government. Dr. Eric Hoskins was commissioned to lay out what is a path to establishing universal pharmacare. He put forward a report. In that report, he stated the system should be universal and entirely public and delivered publicly. That report, to this day, the Liberal government hasn't actually accepted their own report. In that report, one of the key steps that Dr. Hoskins established was, in order to move forward with a universal pharmacare, there needs to be a Canadian Pharmacare Act with the same principles as a Canada Health Act. That's what he said in his report, commissioned by the Liberal government, that needs to happen in order for us to actually have this medication coverage for all. The same way the Canada Health Act was needed for us to bring in universal health care. All provinces didn't sign on right away, but we needed that framework so that we could move forward. It was the key step in establishing what is now something we're so proud of, the universal health care, so families can go to get care if they need it, no matter how much they earn or how much money they have in their banks. Similarly, for medication coverage, this is that same step to establish the framework that is required for us to then sign up provinces. Without this framework, the report states very clearly we cannot move forward. This is a clear step forward, and it is recommended by this report as one of the steps. So if they vote against this, they're voting against the framework. It's like voting against the Canada Health Act. They're opposed to one of the key steps to make sure we have got medication coverage for all. That's what this Liberal government would be doing. If they vote against this, they're voting against what their own report indicates is necessary. And secondly, they're showing that they're not on the side of people, they're on the side of big pharma. That's what that vote would show.
Mr. Julian, do you have anything to add on whether or not this is misrepresenting what the legislation is actually doing?
Quite the contrary, as Mr. Singh has just said. What we have is what the Hoskins report called for. And it is, I think, quite indicative that the Liberal government has not introduced this legislation. They should have done it. We did the work for them. But this is the very clear first major step that then leads to the negotiations with the provinces around finances and formulary. And as we've seen with development of universal health care, both steps are essential. Not having this bill, not having these principles mean that we don't get public universal pharmacare. It's very clear, and the Hoskins report was very, very clear about that.
So clearly, as you outlined, this is the first step, and there are many other steps that need to be put in place. Probably the most difficult is getting the provinces on board. So is it fair to say that this bill will bring pharmacare to universal pharmacare to a reality, or to make it a reality, when there's so many steps? So are you misrepresenting what this bill is what this bill can do?
If we want to walk towards a certain destination and we take a step towards that destination, that step is integral. Today is a step in that direction. And it is a framework, the very same framework, which is the foundation of our universal healthcare system. If the Liberal government today was to vote against the Canada Health Act, we would not have universal healthcare. That's what they're doing today, if they vote against it. They're voting against the very well-established principles that all provinces already agree with. They agree with the Canada Health Act. That's a well-established principle. To include Pharmacare, we have to lay out that same framework. We have to say those same 5 principles should apply when it comes to medication. That's what we're doing today. If they're not willing to accept the framework, the foundation, there will be no universal pharmacare. Their own report indicates it. This is the step, the first major step to establishing medication coverage for all. The same way in the past when we took the step to establish the Canada Health Act, when we started negotiating with provinces, the first step to make sure every single Canadian could go to a hospital or go to a doctor without having to worry about how much it cost was establishing the Canada Health Act. In that same way, this is the step recommended by the commission, the report that was commissioned. We need this framework. This is exactly what their report says it needs to happen. We are putting it forward. If the government was serious, they would have done it themselves. And we've seen so far that Northwest Territories is endorsing this bill. They're showing that that's how it's going to happen. When a province or a territory supports it, we'll see more and more provinces and territories sign on. But without having anything to sign on to, we're not going to see the steps forward. This is vital. This framework sets up the steps forward so that we can say, hey, this is what we're looking for. It is principles that you already agree with, and this is how we can move forward to make sure everyone in our country can get medication that they need. No matter how much they earn, no matter how much is in their bank account, they can get the medication that they need. This is vital. And if the Liberals vote against it, they're voting against what they've committed to do. They're voting against people, and they're taking a side with big pharmaceuticals. And I hope they don't do that.
Next question, the Canadian Press.
Chris Reynolds, Canadian Press.
Hey there.
Hello. Over the past year, we've seen how big pharma exerts a kind of leverage when it comes at least to vaccines, vaccine procurement and distribution. So I'm wondering how our experience here in Canada over the past 11 months or so with big pharmaceutical companies has informed this legislation around Pharmacare. Has it not really? Is this something that was thought of before, regardless of what we've seen over the past year?
This is something we established in advance of the pandemic. But what the pandemic has shown us and what big pharma's behavior has shown us is that when the Liberals take their side, it doesn't actually help people. When they don't stand up to big pharma, it actually hurts people. Liberals have time and time again chosen to support big pharma, and it hasn't made us any better off than other countries. You've got smaller countries with smaller economies that are doing far better than us. So caving into Big Pharma, supporting them, going on their side has hurt Canadians. One clear example of what the Liberal government has done is there was supposed to be a change in the list of countries that we use to set our drug prices. The committee that's tasked with this work to set drug prices in Canada said we need a better list of countries. If you give us a better list of countries, we can actually establish better prices. It will lower the cost of medication. That was something the Liberal government promised to do. They were lobbied aggressively, and they've broken away from that promise. It was a zero-cost solution that would have dropped the cost of medication significantly, and the Liberal government did not follow through. It was their own commitment. They promised to do it. Just update the list of countries. They didn't do it, and it's hurt Canadians. In all of this, we're seeing again and again, the Liberals choose a side of Big Pharma, and it hurts Canadians. What we have been informed by in this pandemic is the importance of local capacity to produce vaccines and, frankly, public capacity, and why we need to have a Cannot laboratory type publicly owned ability to make our own vaccines and critical drugs. That's become very apparent. And more than ever, the ability to fight for the best possible prices and to negotiate so that all Canadians can get access to medication is something that has become even more vital with what we've seen. So we, I guess, anticipated it, but now the evidence shows more than ever we absolutely need universal pharmacare.
A double-barreled question here. First of all, the advisory council headed by Mr. Hoskins pegged the annual cost of single-payer pharmacare, a single-payer pharmacare plan at $15 billion. So the first question would be, is that roughly what you estimate this program will be? And second of all, can we confirm whether the NDP will withhold support for the Liberal budget if the Liberals don't support this legislation?
So on the first, yeah, that's the estimate that we've seen, and that's kind of what we're operating with. I think it's also important to acknowledge, though, that this is an investment. When we invest in Pharmacare, what's going to happen, and it's already been, there's evidence provided by the Parliamentary Budget Office that supports this. This will reduce the cost for the federal government when it comes to purchasing medication. It will reduce costs for provincial governments and territorial governments. But the other savings that has not actually been factored in or calculated is the savings when someone who has an illness is able to maintain their health by taking medication, and how that cost of the extreme level of an infection or an illness, the extreme state of that illness is so much more costly to deal with. So imagine someone with any sort of illness, if they can treat it and keep themselves healthy by being able to access medication, then it will cost the healthcare system a lot less than if they aren't able to stay healthy and they get into the worst case of that illness. So there's massive savings. This is an investment. It's the right thing to do. It's going to save us money. It's also going to make us more competitive as a country. If medication coverage is included, it's something that will no longer be on the negotiation table when it comes to businesses that have to hire staff. They don't have to worry about a drug plan. It's already covered. The same way our healthcare plan is an advantage for businesses to set up here. This is an entirely win for people, win for jobs, a win for saving money, morally the right thing to do. The only people that are against this are Big Pharma and potentially the Liberal government. This is the right thing to do. Oh, and the second part of the question was, yes, support.
Withholding support if the Liberals don't support this bill.
Yes. On the support question, I've said that right now, while we're in a pandemic, while we're fighting the pandemic, the priority has to be getting everyone vaccinated. And we do not think it's the right thing to do go to an election while we should be fighting the pandemic. So we are not going to trigger an election. So that means any confidence vote. We will not trigger an election. We will vote to keep the government going so that our priority remains keeping people top of mind, getting vaccinated, getting the vaccine, fighting this pandemic. That's got to be the priority until we get past this fight. That's right now the biggest fight that we have.
We'll have time for last question on the phone. Opérateur, nous allons prendre une dernière question au téléphone.
There are no questions registered at this time. I'd like to turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference then. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, and a big thank you again to Peter Julian. Thank you. Merci à tout le monde. Merci.